Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Anna Kurian and I teach in the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. Today we are considering the paper 2 of English literature for MA students, and this is devoted to the literature of England from 1590 through to 1798. This is the unit which is devoted to Jonathan Swift and his story, his novel, Gullivers Travels, and this is also under the unit which is devoted to the novel in the 18th century. Initially, we shall be looking at the development of the novel as a genre in the 18th century. From there, we shall progress to the life of Jonathan Swift, and later on, we shall of course consider the novel in some detail. The novel as a genre developed in the 18th century. Before this, we had various other kinds of prose narratives, but we did not have a novel as such. The development of the novel is attributed to various social and economic reasons of the time. However, we can read about this in more detail in the background unit in this course, which is devoted to the rise of the novel as a genre itself. However, here for a brief recapitulation, we will talk about how come the novel came to be such a prominent genre in the 18th century. One of the reasons for this is the development of a middle class which had access to education and which had access to some money so that they could read novels that were being published during this time. So as a result of this, more and more people began to write. In addition to this, there was also an interest in travelogues and in reading as a form of entertainment. Now, in the 18th century, when people wanted to read more and more about travels, we have famous novels such as Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, which come out during this period. Several writers epitomize the depth of novel writing during this period. Amongst them are Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, Richardson, who wrote Pamela and Clarissa, Fielding, who then wrote Joseph Andrews, and Lawrence Sterne, who wrote Tristram Shandy. It was not just men who were writing during this period, though they are of course the more acclaimed of the lot. Female writers during this period include Aphra Behn, who is the first woman to have made her living entirely by writing, Fanny Burney, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Spirited Defense, one of the first and earliest feminist tracts of the time, Lady Mary Wortley Montague, etc. One of the prominent features of the literature of the period, not just the novel but literature as a whole, was that satire was very popular. And this satire was there in both poetry as well as in prose. So in the novel tradition, you have satire such as what we have here in this text, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. But in poetry, where we see satire is in the poetry of Alexander Pope, who was famous for the satires that he wrote. And we shall now be looking at why satire becomes so crucial during this period. One of the reasons for this was that society as such was seen as having decayed from an earlier golden standard, which was in pre-Restoration times, during the Puritan times, as well as, of course, before that, during the English Renaissance. Society was seen to have been degraded, it had become more commercialized, there were a lot of problems which people perceived in the society of the period. And as a result, satire became a prominent way of attacking what they saw as the moral delinquency of the time. In addition, there were also the fact that enlightenment and the growth of knowledge as well as the growth of the human spirit as well as endeavor was seen as having reached a new standard, while at the same time ordinary life was declining in its morals as well as in the character of the people. Therefore then you have a lot of criticism of the period which is couched in satirical writing such as Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, but also of course other writing by Swift. And satire becomes a prominent theme as well as form during this period. To move on to Jonathan Swift, briefly, we will cover his biographical information. And he was born on November 30th, 1667 in Dublin. Though born to English parents, he had to, however, leave Ireland and move to England later on. And in 1688, he came to England. There later, he starts his writing career, and his poetry was mainly in the form of odd verses written to friends and admirers. His first noteworthy work was The Battle of Books, which still continues to be read, also because it was an interesting account of the differences between old learning and new learning and the ways in which dispute was resolved. He also wrote about other things, and one of the most famous works that is his is, of course, Gulliver's Travels, which was published in 1726 and was an instant success. But in addition to this, he also wrote something called A Modest Proposal, which was meant as a piece of satire, which then indicted the famine in Ireland and said that because people were starving, they could as well eat the babies. So the modest proposal was that the babies of the poor could be eaten by the rich, and therefore then the famine could be averted. Jonathan Swift dies in the end of 1745, and he wrote his own epitaph, his own obituary, and he said, and I quote, "He gave the little wealth he had to build a house for fools and mad, and showed by one satiric touch no nation needed it so much." Now, Jonathan Swift had and continues to have a great reach in English literature, not necessarily because of the positions that he occupied or because of the poetry that he wrote, but because his satire was so incisive, and his satire, even though it was directed at the society of his times, remains pertinent even today, because the satire that he wrote, especially Gulliver's Travels, targets different kinds of people rather than specificities in time and space. In our second module, Gulliver's Travels, a brief summary, we will take a quick look at how Gulliver's Travels is structured. But before we do that, Gulliver's Travels, when it was initially published in 1726, was called Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. And interestingly, it was Alexander Pope who lauded its publication and who said that it is universally read, from the Cabinet Council to the nursery. And that gives us one way of thinking about Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels was initially not meant as a children's book. Nowadays, most children encounter it in their early days because abridged versions are available across the world, where we are told about the adventures that Gulliver has. And those adventures are not read as satire, but just as plain, simple adventure of an Englishman who travels all over the world into fantastic lands, and there he meets fantastic people. So the tradition of seeing Gulliver's Travels as children's literature is actually wrong, because Gulliver's Travels was not meant for children's entertainment, but rather it was meant as something serious and satirical, which was supposed to show the Englishman how his character was flawed and what he could do to improve himself. However, we continue to read it in some part as children's literature. Now, Gulliver's Travels, to summarize it, is divided into 4 parts. In each part, the hero, Lemuel Gulliver, who is an Englishman, travels across the seas and reaches a different land, a different island, usually. The first of these is the island of Lilliput, which has tiny people, pygmies. And these people they have fights, they are rather weird in their customs, because though they are ruled by a king, all advancement depends upon how high they can jump, and they have weird arguments as to which end of an egg is larger, and so on and so forth. Now, by using the island of Lilliput and the tiny people over there as an example, he shows us how petty people can be. And this is his first travel. On his first voyage on the ship Antelope, he is washed up on this little island where only tiny people live. In the midst of those tiny people, Gulliver is, of course, this huge towering giant, and they capture him and they tie him down and they keep him captive. There are, of course, also wars between nations on the island itself, and Gulliver helps one against the other. Interestingly, he is not given any personal advantage because of that help, but later on he has problems because of the fact that he helped them. In the second island which he reaches, after this, of course, he goes back to England. He's picked up by an English ship, he goes back to England, and then later on he sets out again. The second island that he visits is called Brobdingnag, and here everybody else is huge and he is the one who is tiny. The interesting part about this is that even though he is tiny and he is therefore at a disadvantage, the giants over there are extremely civil and civilized both. So they keep him like a pet, yes, but they also take excellent care of him. And when he does offer them the use of gunpowder, their civilization has reached a point where they say that no, warfare is inimical to the life of man, and therefore they refuse his gift of gunpowder, which again then points us to the fact that Jonathan Swift is satirizing a world wherein wars are so common and where everybody is ever so willing to kill everybody else. Once again, after visiting Brobdingnag, Gulliver then of course goes back, he leaves and returns home to England. The third voyage is rather interesting because here he doesn't just visit one island, but he visits a lot of them. First of all, he finds that he is sitting on an island, he's been washed up on a small island, and he sees a shadow which falls upon him, and he discovers that there is a floating island called Laputa. Now, the interesting thing about Laputa is, of course, that the inhabitants of Laputa are extremely intelligent, intellectual even, and they only consider mathematics and music to be worthwhile. Even more interestingly, their intellectual pursuits blind them to the ordinary, everyday details of life. So therefore, they are unfitted to live life in an everyday fashion. They don't know how to build houses properly, they don't know how to run their lives properly, and they are even unequipped to notice other people. So they have servants whose job is to alert them when somebody approaches, because otherwise they are so engrossed in their pursuit of intellectual activity or musical activity that they do not even notice what is happening around them. In addition to Laputa, he also visits 3 other islands, each of which is in some way or the other unique. So in one of them he meets sorcerers, in another there is an absolute monarchy, and finally then he goes back to England via Japan. The final voyage is, of course, when he visits the 4th island, the island of the talking horses, and the talking horses are called the Houyhnhnms. Now the Houyhnhnms are horses, yes, therefore animal, yes, but they are also more civilized than any human being could ever be. Even more interestingly, the horses have as their slaves the Yahoos, who are actually human beings. They resemble human beings, except they are barbaric, uncivilized, and though they resemble human beings physically, they have none of the civility of a human being. Now, when Gulliver meets the Houyhnhnms, he is extremely impressed by them. He sees them as having achieved a pinnacle of civility and also of having become so civilized that they do not in any way jeopardize the life or the living of any other person. And yet, what happens ironically is that the Houyhnhnms recognize him as being like a Yahoo because of his physical appearance. As a result, then, he has to be banished from there. And when he is banished, he tries very hard to stay back in the land of the Houyhnhnms. And when he does so, they tell him that they cannot keep him there because he is a Yahoo and because he is the way he is, which is human and uncivilized. And therefore, then he's sent back to England. However, as he's picked up and as he comes back to England, he discovers that he dislikes, in fact has an intense aversion, almost a hatred for all human beings. So when he comes back to his family and when he meets the captain of the ship on which he travels, he finds himself unable to converse with them normally. He finds it difficult for him to relate to other human beings because all the time he is lost in admiration of the land of the Houyhnhnms and in the land of the horses, who are then the most civilized there is. So first of all, let us look at the form of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels is essentially set as a travelogue. Now, as we said initially, travelogues were extremely popular during the late 17th and the early 18th century. In fact, they continue to be popular and even today are a best-selling item on many book lists. Now, a travelogue basically begins with somebody setting out from a well-known homeland or a home country and then traveling to other nations, other states, other places which will be unfamiliar and which also offer the person who is traveling a chance to compare this new place with his own place. Now, William Dampier was one of the most famous travel writers of the 18th century, and Gulliver's Travels is in many ways modeled upon that. Jonathan Swift uses nautical jargon and he uses descriptions which are based on ship logs of the time in his writing of the book itself. Now, when we look at Gulliver's Travels, we are enabled to see at least four, if not more, new locations. But in each of those four, we are also expected to make a comparison with what Gulliver left behind in England. Now, in addition to being a travelogue, the form of the book is also, of course, satirical. So, satire holds up human or individual vice to laughter and to some scorn, ridicule, derision. And it is via irony, and though it might be witty and though it might make us laugh, it is also supposed to make us think as to what exactly is wrong with the person who is being satirized, or with the community, society, civilization, religion, whatever it is that is being satirized. We are supposed to think about it, not just laugh about it. Now, when we look at Jonathan Swift writing Gulliver's Travels and we look at the satire over here, we are told about various kinds of satire. First of all, there is, of course, the island of Lilliput, which satirizes court politics, because there everybody is petty. Everybody is interested only in the personal advantage which might accrue to the courtier if they are able to please the king of Lilliput. And as such, it is initially, of course, a satire on court politics, but it is also a satire on hypocrisy and on ingratitude and, of course, on absolute utter pettiness, because their pettiness is seen in things such as the fact that they belong to different parties. They are distinguished between those parties on the height of the heels of the shoes that they wear. Now, that demonstrates to us some level of the pettiness which differentiates people. In addition to that, we are also told that over here, they have no gratitude whatsoever. So though Gulliver helps them in their battle against the neighboring country, eventually, of course, he is not given any advantage for that help. He is not even thanked for that help, and instead he gets into trouble because of that. So that is one version of the satire. The second version, of course, is when he goes to the land of the Brobdingnagians, and there what he finds is that where human beings take pride in their appearance, their physical appearance and their strength, here he is shown that actually it is nothing, because the human over there, Lemuel Gulliver, is the tiniest in the country. The people of the country are all of them huge giants. However, what is also told to us is that to be a real human being, one should also have a large heart, because the people of Brobdingnag are people who are large-hearted, they are magnanimous, they are kind, they are gentle, and they do not believe in warfare. So when we look at then a country such as Brobdingnag, we are supposed to then compare it to England, where people were proud of who they were and where people were also inclined to use gunpowder and wage warfare upon others for petty profit. Whereas here in the land of Brobdingnag, even though they're given the choice, they decline to accept it because they prefer to have a peaceful life and a life wherein they can demonstrate the true goodness of heart that they have. Now, of course, you have the third voyage, Laputa, which is actually interesting because it works upon the criticism of the intellectual, that it's all very well to be fully advanced intellectually, to be a person who is a great mathematician or a great musician, but if you lack all common sense and all practical knowledge, then what is the point of being such an advanced mathematician? In fact, he mocks it at such a level that they cannot do anything, and the only person who is able to run his home well is not held in esteem by them, because what they hold in esteem, the people of Laputa hold in esteem, is knowledge, the knowledge of mathematics specifically and the knowledge of music. So without that, nothing else is held in esteem. What Swift does is show us this entire lopsided kind of fashion in which the world thinks that you can only be good if you are brilliant, that ordinary, everyday common sense is not really necessary. And we are shown that in a sense of ridicule by the text. In the final one, of course, is where his satire is most savage, because there you see how the Houyhnhnms, who are of course horses, it is only reason that works. And here you have the Houyhnhnms who are civilized, who are sober, who are decent people, who do not at any point work for petty advantage for anybody, and instead, in contrast to them, are their slaves, the Yahoos. The Yahoos who are greedy, ill-behaved, who have no civilization whatsoever. And then we are told that the Yahoos are the human beings, the horses are more civilized. And thus, when we see this, what we are shown is that in the form of a travelogue, Jonathan Swift gives us satire. One other way of thinking about the form of this text is to see it as fantasy, because of course there is a strong element of the fantastic in all of this. Here what we are seeing is not real life lands. It's not realism. And actually, when we think about it, the 18th century is famous for realism as well. And yet what we are seeing here is the growth of the fantasy novel, if you will, because the lands that Lemuel Gulliver travels to are lands which are all of them fantastical. Horses who are intelligent and reasonable and sensible. People who are obsessive about mathematics and music to the extent that they cannot even see when other people approach them. Giants, and of course pygmies. So when we look at them, what we are seeing then is the growth of the tradition of fantasy in English literature as well. In our next section, we shall be looking at the idea of characterization as we see it developing in this text. Now, Gulliver, the hero of our story, is just a normal, everyday, middle-class Englishman. The only thing that is significant about him, at least initially, is that he loves adventure and he wants to travel. So he begins as a ship surgeon, and at the end of the text, he has by then captained several voyages himself, and he is a renowned seafarer. However, what we also see is that Gulliver is, in some senses, and this is where it becomes perfect for children's literature, he is a person who is shaped by the experiences that he undergoes, so that it's in some senses a Bildungsroman. It grows. He grows as he travels. And so when we look at Gulliver, from the movement at the beginning of the first voyage, when he travels out of England, through Lilliput, through Brobdingnag and Laputa, finally to the land of the Houyhnhnms, we see a Gulliver who is growing and developing. Now, each of the islands is also, of course, inhabited by a race of people who are, in some senses or the other, separate and unique in the characterization that they possess. Now, the Lilliputians are examples of the pettiness and the pride of the human beings. So they have absolutely no sense in them. Like I said earlier, they determine things by the sizes of the heels that they wear. Their fights are about equally petty things. And each of the incidents that are described over there, they show us how small-minded the people are. They were also supposed to be an example of how small-minded the English were during this period, where their fights were all of them trivial, about trivial things, and where everything that they did and the examples that are used within the text are also seen as having parallels in the government of the time. The Brobdingnags, of course, are people who stand for the goodness of the human soul. Now, the goodness of the human soul is, however, contrasted with the idea that the humans themselves have about how elevated they are, about their great moral stature, about their wonderful goodness that is embodied by the human being. Jonathan Swift holds that up to ridicule by showing us that even as Gulliver, who believes that he is such a good human being, offers them gunpowder, they refuse it. So the Brobdingnag people are humans as they would be if they were to be truly good, whereas the humans themselves are seen to be not so good as they believe themselves to be. The people of Laputa are those who are embodiments of the intellect, but an intellect which is not redeemed by everyday good sense. So when you have knowledge, and only intellectual knowledge, not necessarily wisdom, but only textbook knowledge, shall we say. So when you have textbook knowledge but you do not have wisdom, that's what happens if you are a Laputian. Because the Laputians are so engrossed in their pursuit of mathematics and music that they have no time or attention to give to practical matters. And they have servants with flappers who strike their ears and mouth to alert them when they have to listen or to speak. So they do not even have the common sense to say anything to anybody else until they are told that they must speak at any given point in time. And nobody cares about what is happening in the lives of anybody else. So when we look at what is happening here in Laputa, what we are being also told about is the kind of ivory tower that academics and academicians occupy, where they have no real connection to the real world which is out there. Then, of course, the final island, the land of the Huinums, which is where there is both goodness as well as there is intellect. So the perfect people are the horses. They have reason, they have common sense, they have goodness, all virtues embodied in the horses. They are also interesting because what Gulliver sees is that they do not have individual names. They also subdue individual requirements and individual needs to the good of the community as a whole. Now, when we see this, what we should also think about is whether Jonathan Swift is advocating a land wherein the good of the greater number is being subdued to the good of the individual. However, finally, when he does leave it, because he is a Yahoo, we are then asked to think about who it is or what it is that a Yahoo embodies. The Yahoo as a character stands for, of course, the humans, but they also stand for the bestial nature of the humans. They are greedy, they are violent, they are avaricious, they are greedy, and they are destructive. And this is what the human being is. Unfortunately, what happens to Gulliver is, as he passes through all these islands and he sees all these things, he begins to dislike human beings. And when he's finally taken away from the island of the Huinims and he meets the captain of the ship is actually a very decent human being. He's somebody who represents the best of human beings. And yet, when Gulliver meets him, he can't deal with him at all. He can't stand him. He cannot bear to be in the same company as this man. In addition to that, he is disgusted with himself because he has a human family, or as he calls it, or as he thinks of it, a Yahoo family. And as it says that he could have lived with a Yahoo and had babies with them, it disgusts him. It causes extreme revulsion in him. So what we are also then being asked to think of as development of character is that Gulliver grows from being a human being who believes in the decency and the goodness of human beings to being somebody who is revolted by the idea of the human himself. Finally, of course, we come to the themes of Gulliver's Travels. Of course, it's simple to say that it satirizes human nature and human folly, but one of the significant themes of Gulliver's Travels is the use and abuse of power. Now, when we look at the text, what we see is that in each of the islands that Gulliver visits, there are several people who wield power, and we are asked to look at them and to consider the effects of that power that they wield and whether they wield it rightly or wrongly. Now, the Lilliputian king, the king of the pygmies, he abuses the power that he wields over others. And he insists that his courtiers should, if necessary, degrade themselves just so that they can be applauded by him and they can be in the king's good books. Now, that's one abuse of power. Whereas on the other hand, you have the king of Laputa who does not care about the everyday welfare of his own people, which is another version of the abuse of power. If we see these two as being about the abuse of power, then what you have in the Brobdingnagian king is how power can be rightfully used for the good of the people, and so that in no way does it harm any of the people over whom he rules. So both the Brobdingnagians as well as the Huinims show us how power should be used, whereas the other two, Laputa and Lilliput, are emblematic of how power can be misused and used for the abuse of the ordinary person. The other main theme in this text is about pride. And pride, it's interesting because everybody is proud about something within the text, including Gulliver. And we are shown how that pride can then be taken away from one because you have shown how stupidly misplaced that pride is. Now, first of all, there is, of course, the Lilliputians, who are tiny people and who are very proud of their military. And yet, when we look at them in their land, what we are also thinking about is the fact that Gulliver, who is so huge, could crush their entire army if he were just to try to do so. So, when we look at the pride of the Lilliputians in their army, it's misplaced pride. Similarly, Gulliver, when he begins his journey, and when he goes to the Brobdingnagians, he is very proud of human achievements. And the things that human beings have, including, of course, gunpowder, which they can use for the decimation of others. And yet he is shown that that pride is misplaced too. Eventually, what we see is that Gulliver's pride changes, where Gulliver earlier was proud of the achievements of the human race. He is then shown that that pride is misplaced. But at the end, he has a different kind of pride, which we shall return to shortly. However, the Laputians are very proud of the achievements that they have in mathematics, music, and the intellect. And yet we are also shown that that pride is very silly, because their everyday life is a disaster, because they do not know how to live every day. Their daily life, they cannot live in peace and quiet. So nothing works out well for them, and people are trying to escape from the island of Laputa because they cannot live their ordinary lives in peace and quiet, because the intellectual life has so taken over all of them. And finally, of course, the Houyhnhnms. And here, once again, you both have the abuse of power, because the Houyhnhnms debate whether the Yahoos should be allowed to live at all. Now, power that any group enjoys over anybody else is also pinpointed for us over here. To go back to the idea of pride, now Gulliver's pride initially is in the achievements of the human race, but later on, once he has met the Houyhnhnms and he discovers that he is only a Yahoo, bestial, greedy, a dirty person basically, he is then proud of having met the Houyhnhnms, and he is also proud of the fact that he almost became a part of that society. As a result, then, he looks with disgust upon the captain of the ship that rescues him, as well as upon his wife and children. So pride continues to be a motive right till the very end of the text. In addition to this, there are also, and this is something which is particularly interesting, because the 18th century did not talk about the body of man. It talked about the intellect, it talked about the spirit of man, but it did not talk about the body of man. And yet, Jonathan Swift makes it very clear that man is not only for reason and the rational, but it is also about the bodily and excretory functions. So we are constantly being reminded that the human is not only mind or not only spirit, but is also a body, and a body which is in its everyday needs. It requires certain things and it requires to do certain things. And therefore we are told over and over again that the human body is not made up of only the mind, but is made up of the mind and the body. Eventually, of course, we must also think about Gulliver's Travels as being about the individual and society. Gulliver is somebody who begins in a society, visits various other societies, but is never at any point comfortable in any of them. So the only society in which he wants to live and continue to live is the land of the horses, the Houyhnhnms, and yet they throw him out. So what kind of a society is it that would be perfect, and where a human being would fit in, is a question that Gulliver's Travels leaves with us. Gulliver's Travels has over the years had a very mixed reception. Initially, when it was published, it was seen as an extremely savage satire upon human beings. Later on, especially after the First World War, it was seen as being topical. People admired it because it was seen as something which was typical of what was happening in the world. Now, in its time, Swift had said that I heartily hate and detest that animal called man. And what he does in Gulliver's Travels is show us that actually man is just an animal, like any other animal. And that animals such as the horses may be far more civilized than he is. So when we look at Gulliver's Travels, then we are looking at a text that combines many things in it. Even as it is a satire, it also is a folk myth. It's a fantasy. It gives us worlds wherein you have pygmies and dwarfs, you have giants, you have floating islands, and you have talking horses. So in that sense, Gulliver's Travels continues to live as one of the most indispensable books in world literature. If you want to know more about Gulliver's Travels, check out the lesson in all its detail, but also, of course, try and read the entire book for yourself.